Hello, everyone, and welcome to this special edition of Listening to America. I'm Clay Jenkinson. I'm in Chicago, or Greater Chicago, and I gave a performance as J. Robert Oppenheimer the other day, and in the audience was a dear friend of mine, Stephen Duchrow, who, among other things, is an impersonator, if I may use that term, of the great poet Carl Sandburg. We've had a conversation on this program before about how Chautauquans do their work. You were in the audience the other night, and thank you for coming. I would never have invited you because I feel I have a shyness about this sort of thing, but there you were, and I so appreciated it. And then you said really nice things afterwards, and now I would like to talk about what you and I do. I portray a number of historical characters. I think you portray two.
Correct. I'm working on a third.
So who are your two? I know Carl Sandburg, a famous poet.
Carl Sandburg and not a household name, Vachel Lindsay. They're both the two of the Illinois Prairie poets.
And who's the third?
And I'm working on Mark Twain.
Mark Twain. Okay, you joined the 350,000 other Mark Twain impersonators.
Yes, I know. It might just be more to learn Twain and get some acting chops because he was so interesting and socially relevant. And, I had an opportunity to have Hal Holbrook perform once, and I was so touched by Hal Holbrook, the man, that I thought, these monologues are extraordinary. So it's good practice.
Just promise me you will not wear a white suit.
No, I won't. He didn't often wear a white suit. He wore a black suit sometimes.
No, Hal Holbrook immortalized Mark Twain tonight. I've seen him in, I think, Albuquerque. He was an extraordinary man, an extraordinary actor, and he was Mark Twain. But he portrayed Twain in the white suit. And, Twain is like Theodore Roosevelt. He is so easily caricatured because he was himself a caricature of himself.
Right.
But I knew a friend up at Lake Tahoe who performed as Mark Twain, but he would only say quips. He wouldn't go into the darkness, and there was a good deal of darkness in Twain's soul and some severe criticism of American life. He was, for example, a very principled antagonist to the idea of American imperialism, and he wrote a famous essay about that called "To the Person Sitting in Darkness," which is just about as grim a critique of American purposes as you could get. I love Samuel Clemens, Mark Twain. So you are starting. So let's just say that 2 years from now, you're going to be, please welcome Samuel Clemens. How does one in your time of life, you're not 30, go about preparing to become a historical character?
Well, first of all, as you know, and I would say exemplify so well, you get steeped in the character, and that is reading. And that's the one thing I love about what you do, is that it isn't about costume. It is about content and command of the character. And that's comes from reading and extensive note-taking, and then pulling out all the A parts and all the great language, and then sequencing it and assembling it. And I'm going through a lot of steps here and putting it into some sort of dramatic arc so that it works and the audience believes you. It feels faithful. It feels true. And I think that you love it. I mean, that was the advice you give me. You have to love this. And you do. You have to love it, because the memorization, whether it's a script or not, it is something that, it dogs you. You have to keep it fresh. You've got to keep working on it, even though you may not want to say it one more time, because when you're in front of that audience, you got to be ready. So, those are some of the things. Read deeply, question, why would this man do this? What would make a man want to do this? Why would he say this?
That's what they say of us. Why would we do this dumb thing and dress up in dorky costumes and get on stage and fumble around with important quotations? But so let me ask you this question. Like with someone like Meriwether Lewis, one of my characters, you have to tell the story. We left St. Louis on such and such a day. We traveled up and wintered in what's now North Dakota. We crossed the Bitterroot Mountains. That was an ordeal. Came back. There's a story you have to tell. If you just came in and said, I'm Meriwether Lewis, I'd like to spend the hour talking about Native American policy, that would be a failure. With Thomas Jefferson, you don't have to do that. You don't have to say, I was the president of the United States. I wrote the Declaration of Independence. These are universally known in American life. And so I can move around with Jefferson, and he was a Renaissance man, so I get to move around. I might talk about paleontology. I might talk about the Library of Congress. I might talk about Jefferson and wine. I might talk about Jefferson and the Constitution. With J. Robert Oppenheimer, the character I performed the other night in your presence, you have to tell the story of the atomic bomb. If he just says, let me talk about quantum mechanics, A, they'll leave, and B, I'll leave because I don't command enough real understanding of it to be able to give a compelling discussion of it. So I know how to tell this story. With Twain, it's a little bit between. Everyone knows there's a Mark Twain. Everyone knows that he wrote Huckleberry Finn. Not everybody knows that he wrote Joan of Arc. So you get to move around with this to a certain degree. But it would seem to me that if you're up there for an hour and you don't mention Huckleberry Finn, you have failed. So as you look at it, how do you decide, sort of from the kind of rotary elevator speech, what absolutely has to be in every performance and what can shift?
Great story. I mean, there just has to be great stories or has to be great words. And you've got to edit and select and sequence. And then, you are following it always works and has worked since the beginning of time to have a beginning, a middle, and an end, to have a character that maybe usually that you sympathize with on some level. And then there's an obstacle or obstacles, and the stakes get raised, and there's a moment of tension, and then that character either succeeds or fails. Now, that doesn't mean you can't have other characters like Twain where you maybe just do excerpts of some of the pathos and some of the humor, and that's enough. But in many cases, you're telling a story and you're showing an arc, and that arc has tragedy and maybe has some joy, maybe has some humor in it. And if you do it right and tell it right and embody it and live it, you put the people in the room. And it's easier said than done, but you're trying to put people in the room with the incident so they feel it and they feel whatever emotion is coming from you. That when Hanman, from the great acting teacher, would say, if you make it live for you, you make it live for the audience. And so that's what you're after, I think.
I get this. So if I were going to take on Mark Twain, first of all, you have to read Mark Twain. And that's no easy task. I mean, he wrote a bunch of books. And so there's that. And, you have to read A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court. You have to read Roughing It. You have to read Pudd'nhead Wilson. It's not just the greatest hits. You've got to know all this, because someone in the audience is going to say, well, what were you trying to get at with Connecticut Yankee? And then you're like, oh, gee, I'm sorry, sir. I haven't written that yet. My wife is ill. I must go see her. Then you have to read biographies. And the way I do it, and I want to hear how you do it, but I always read a kind of popular biography first. I usually something written in the 1950s, because there's no postmodern theory, there's no semiology, there's no structuralism, there's no American revisionism. It's just delivering up a beginning, middle, and end of the story of Mark Twain. And I take absolutely obsessive notes. I mean, every single date, every detail, every incident. And then when I've done that, that's just to get the layout. That's just to get the timeline. Once I've done that, then I go read 2 or 3 recent biographies, which are much more scholarly and deeper and often revisionist. And then I add to that kind of framework that I started off early. How do you do it?
Pretty similar. I'll read. With Sandburg, I have the advantage of, you can hear him read, you can hear him sing, you can hear him read Lincoln. So I have that material to listen to. But then you have a lot of great biographies. You have the Penelope Niven biography. You have the Callahan biography. You have the Harry Hansen biography. There's a lot to get into. You can go down to his home.
Where is that?
He was born in Galesburg, and he's buried.
There's a place there related to him. But he also was in North Carolina.
Yes, he was in Wisconsin for a while when he was like the chief of staff to the socialist mayor of Milwaukee. Then he made his way down to Chicago. He was in Maywood. He was in Elmhurst. Then he moved to Michigan, Harbert, where they built a home. And then eventually out to North Carolina at Connemara, which was near Asheville and by Flat Rock.
And his place there is still preserved.
It is.
My good friend Russ Eagle was recently there, and he said it's spectacular. Have you been?
No, I'm going to be headed that way. And but everyone I've talked to that's went there was just transfixed by it, because it's my understanding, right or wrong. I mean, the National Park Service owns it. It's a beautiful property, as Sandburg described it. but there's books and papers everywhere. So if you walk into his office, I think it gives you a feel that, he was just there a little while ago.
That's my understanding too. So there's that. So there's site visits, and you live in the region of his most productive work, so you can do site visits to Galesburg and so on. You've read all these biographies. You've taken extensive notes. How do you organize all this?
I start to put together some kind of great opening line. Sandburg would say something like, I'll probably die propped up in bed trying to write a poem about America. Good opening line. Or Edmund Wilson said, the worst thing that ever happened to Abraham Lincoln after he was shot by John Wilkes Booth was to fall into the hands of Carl Sandburg.
I used to
Wilson was mean-spirited.
Yes. I like Edmund Wilson up to a point, but he was a mean-spirited critic, and he was awful to my man John Steinbeck, and apparently to yours, Carl Sandburg. You spend a couple of years getting ready for a performance as Carl Sandburg, and of course that doesn't mean that the telephone will ring. So it's not like performing as, say, Abraham Lincoln, where everybody wants Lincoln, everybody wants Abigail Adams, everybody wants Mark Twain. Not everyone wants J. Robert Oppenheimer. Not everyone wants Carl Sandburg, or for that matter, Vachel Lindsay. And so that comes with the territory. And I always tell people who are thinking about doing a Chautauqua character, you have to be able to market this thing. It's not worth doing 3 or 4 years on this and then getting one little gig at a Rotary Club. You've got to be able to, this has got to be something that people want to hear. And poetry, as you know, is intimidating to the American people, and so that creates another boundary. On the other hand, Carl Sandburg is very much in the mode of Walt Whitman, these very democratic poets, and he has an accessibility that, say, John Donne would not have, or John Milton. We need to take a break. When we come back, I want to turn our attention a little bit to J. Robert Oppenheimer and continue talking about how a Chautauqua performance comes to be. Thanks, everyone. We'll be back. You're listening to a special edition of Listening to America. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Clay Jenkinson. Across from me virtually, although we're basically in the same conurbation, is Stephen Duchrow, who is a performer, also an impresario, who was one of the founders of the Rao Center, which I performed at the other night, and has done other important work of making a platform for musical and stage performances for all sorts of entities. And that's how we met, actually, and I'm so glad we did. The other day we were talking, and we were unfortunately not recording it, about Sandburg, and our own discussion, I think, led you to change your view of something.
Yes, the last time we did a podcast about Chautauqua characters, I decided, I'm going to do Carl Sandburg's Abraham Lincoln, which is like Sandburg is Mount Rainier and Lincoln is Everest times 2.
So was Wilson right? Was Wilson right that Sandburg's Lincoln is interesting, but it's not a good Lincoln?
No, it's absolutely wrong. The Lincoln that Sandburg wrote had to be written, and in some ways, I would make the case that he was one of the better people to write it, because he was from the Midwest. He grew up during that time. He shined the boots of Civil War soldiers when he was a boy that served under Sherman and Grant. He met people that knew Lincoln. That gives him, certainly he's in the region, so he understands the prairie and understands the people. But he was a poet, and so was Lincoln. So you have a poet capturing a poet, and he's writing it almost as if it's an epic poem. He was criticized for not doing citations in it, but when you read it, clearly here is someone who, as a newspaper man, has absolute detail that he builds on and builds on and builds on and creates a moment. And then he's got this fluidity with language, which at times is just stunning. You just sit back at the end of the paragraph and you say, well, now there's a writer.
So you move down this path of taking on Lincoln as part of the performance. And of course, I'm a great admirer of Lincoln, particularly for his capacity with the English language. I think no president, including Mr. Jefferson, ever used the English language as well as Abraham Lincoln. Just quickly, what's your favorite, the Gettysburg Address or the second inaugural?
Oh, I'm gonna pick a dark horse. I like some of these. There's a private meditation he writes to himself about slavery and how long it was going to take to extinguish it that he never uses. There's a definition of democracy that it has, which I think is wonderful. And I like Sandburg's description of Gettysburg, which uses a little bit of that particular piece, but it's a 4-minute oration, and we won't do that now.
I remember from being in school long, long ago, we had to memorize the Gettysburg Address. No one ever mentioned the second inaugural at that point. We were told that Lincoln kind of scratched it on an envelope while he was waiting, and that Everett, one of the great and popular orators of the country, gave a 2-hour plus speech, and that's what everyone sort of expected, that Lincoln would roar into a full oratorical mode, but instead he gave this, 218-word address, which turned out to be one of the great things ever spoken in the United States. Am I wrong about the envelope?
Yeah, yes. Well, the historians I've read said no, he didn't scratch it out. And they give evidence of other things he was doing on the train that he couldn't really have done it, that he did plan it out. You know, Lincoln was a tragic character. J. Robert Oppenheimer was a tragic character. In fact, we talked the other day about the two photos.
The late photo of Lincoln, the haunted late photo of Abraham Lincoln, and then the haunted photo of Oppenheimer. And if you put them side by side, you see what life can do to those that carry its burdens most.
Absolutely, it's haunting to see them. And Sandburg's got this phrase about Lincoln. You know, his face, his form of slumping arches, and his face of gaunt sockets. His face, it was so sad, it was so haunted, and yet so comic and quizzical. It was as if someone was lighting and unlighting and relighting a lantern. He had shapes that a great artist scribbled out of careless clay. You know, I think that's just a wonderful way. And I can see that with both of those characters. And I sort of see it in the Henry Moore sculpture. When I saw it, I saw you visit there.
Oh, you mean the sculpture of the atomic pile at the University of Chicago at Stagg Field?
I'm leaping here in something that hopefully, but when I looked at it first, I saw a gaunt kind of skull from one perspective, and then looked at it from another, and it looks a little bit like maybe a mushroom cloud. That might just be me.
Maybe it's a helmet. This is Henry Moore, who was an abstract sculptor, British. Fabulous 20th century sculptor, called upon to produce a memorial to the first sustained chain reaction, which occurred on December 2nd, 1942 at the University of Chicago in the squash court under Stagg Field. One of the things that helps you talk about being real or being there or putting the audience with you, you'll remember from the other day that at sort of the climax of the program, the first climax, there are two, but he climbed up the tower. On the night before they detonated it, he thought, I have to climb the tower. I have to go check the plugs. I need to go up there. So he goes up there, and there's a thunderstorm coming, and there's, skies of the desert and the roseate hue and the heat lightning and the kind of breeze that comes an hour before a storm. And it's already drizzling a little bit. And then he has this sort of Promethean moment like, oh my gosh, oh my goodness, I'm now complicit in the creation of a weapon of mass destruction. What does that say? What do you do next? What do you do after you have vaporized 200,000 people in two largely civilian Japanese cities? And so for me, that's the moment, that's the most important moment, because then the whole audience is thinking, yeah, of course. I mean, of course you'd have to think about it. But they hadn't thought about it until I brought them to think about it, and it wasn't by telling them, it was by showing them an incident, a story, something that actually happened. And if I were just saying I was in a study somewhere with a pipe and a glass of port, and I started to think about what I had done, it would have been powerful, but nothing like him sitting on top of the tower with a bomb that's going to go off in 6 hours and feeling the drizzle and the heat lightning all around him. And so when I'm studying for a character, I look for stories that say more than they say. And you can't just say, I went up the tower, checked the plug, sat there for an hour and came down. You have to give this the moment that it deserves. And then the second climax, and I think you really responded to that, is a direct quotation, and it's what he said when he watched the bomb go off. And and I'll just quickly give a part of it. He said, "We all realized that nothing would ever be the same. Some laughed, a few cried, most were silent. I remembered a passage from the Hindu sacred text, the Bhagavad Gita, in which Vishnu is trying to convince the prince to do his duty, and Vishnu takes on his multi-armed form and says, 'I am brighter than 1,000 suns. I am become death, the destroyer of worlds.'" I can't even do it now, sitting in front of a computer looking at you from across Chicago without being moved by that. What a thing to say. And that's why I chose Robert Oppenheimer. You know, it's not a popular choice. Oh yeah, I'd like you to invite me to your community to talk about the making of a weapon of mass destruction, and maybe a lot of technical details about the fissioning of atoms. But when I realized that he said that, when I first learned that he said that, I thought, this is one of the most interesting people I will ever have encountered in the whole course of my life. So that's what hooked me, my friend.
What I loved about your performance, and I've been really wanting to see it for many, many years, so I was very excited. That scene you do so well on the tower. I would add as much emotion into it as you can, because it is a powerful, powerful, powerful scene. And I think what was really spectacular about it was the way you showed the speed of the technology, that it's a metaphorical explosion. Here you have, hundreds of years of physics, and then suddenly, you have a friend of mine said, well, Hubble discovered that there's more than one universe in the 1920s. And then you have neutrons discovered, and then the atom is split, and then they're building Los Alamos, and then the bomb goes off, and then the second bomb goes off, and it's all bam, bam, bam. The fact that you put that timeline together without saying, here's the timeline, but it moves so swiftly that it ties perfectly with Oppenheimer. He's hurtling through space, and maybe his sin is pride. I don't know. He's trying to do a good thing, like the Prometheus, the tragic flaw, maybe pride. He's trying to do a good thing. And then there's that moment that he's on top and he's saying, wait a minute. And so it moves so quickly. And that's something I really took away from it, that it's beyond his power to control it. And then you have that moment at the top. I thought that was tremendous, tremendous part of the presentation.
Well, thank you so much. It's as you know, these things can kind of write themselves. I don't work from a script, but talk about things you can't not include. You can't not include the moment when the test went off. You don't have to include much about Hiroshima or Nagasaki. He didn't see them. He wasn't there. I never call myself an actor. I always call myself a humanities scholar. But if you were my acting coach, I think you would say, in the nicest possible way, don't be afraid to let a little more emotion out on this stuff. Because all my characters, I'm pretty reserved. I'm pretty much an information delivery system, and I play down the theatrics, and I know I could squeeze more from them, but I've always been shy about that. And I think you would say, you're doing just fine, but you could deepen this if you would actually embody a little more emotion up there.
That's what any director would tell any of us. Any director worth his salt is you're really trying to plug into that, and especially Billy Lyons, who have really had the wonderful opportunity to study with in the Wynn Hanman studio the last 3 months, has really said, being vulnerable, pretty important, and I know it's contrary to do that on a public stage, but that matters. And if you can tie it back to some moment that you either feel or see the moment with the character, you understand the circumstances, or you have a memory of yourself that relates to that moment, that helps. And then you just try to go through it without pushing it and just sort of let it unfold. But you already have the character, you have the command of the material, you have the ethos, and that you have the credibility. All of that is already there. The command of the language, and the pathos is the thing that probably is the hardest thing for us all to bring and deliver.
I come at it as a scholar. So my view is if you master the information, the rest will follow. And I've seen excellent theatrics from people who don't know squat about what they're trying to portray. I've seen so many bad Chautauqua performances. I mean, they're legion. It's really, we should be outlawed. It's a horrible form. I was in Kansas, at a humanities event, and there was a professor from the University of Kansas History Department, and he was eminent in his field. And so that always makes me a little nervous, as you might expect. And during the program, I said that, as Jefferson, that I had written a letter to Madison from Paris in which I said we should tear up the Constitution once per generation, about every 19 years. And so the program's over, I get this big ovation and so on. He comes up and says, that didn't happen. That's not true. What you said is not true. You've distorted this. And I said, well, you're the expert, but I've read this letter, and I can show it to you in the Viking portable Jefferson, which I happen to have with me. He said, I don't want to see it. He never said that. And then I said, well, with all due respect, Professor, he did write that letter. So what weight we give to it is an interesting question, but
yes,
I don't think it can be denied that Jefferson wrote this letter. And then he said, well, if he did, he didn't really mean it. And he stalked off. And so shame on him. He was using his power. And as you know, and I've probably gotten more of this than you ever will, but anyone who wants to discredit you can say, yeah, you dress up in tights. You know, the Chautauqua is inherently a kind of a goofball form. And so anyone who thinks that they can trump you on some piece of knowledge or insight or information can just say, oh yeah, well, I'm not wearing a wig. How about you? And so, that bothered me, but I decided at that time, well, that was one instance. And then another one happened a few years later, and I was giving a Jefferson performance for fifth graders. I love fifth graders. That's like the last year before all the trouble begins. In front of these fifth graders, and this girl raised her hand, and she said, the greatest question I ever received. She said, Mr. Jefferson, now that you've been with us, what would you like to take back with you to the 18th century? So if you just think about that question, it's a fabulous question, because she knew I was playing Jefferson. Now she's playing her, and it's a really good question. And so, I wanted to say the Ronco splatter screen or Vegematic, but
yes,
but my
pocket fisherman.
Yeah, well, they come as a package.
Ginsu knife, yes.
I do give Ginsu knives to my friends when they get married, Steve, and so I ordered like 30 sets on eBay for about $6, and they come in this box that looks like it's been run over by a bulldozer, but they're all in there, and I give them to people for their wedding, and then when I give them, I'm seldom there when they open them, thank goodness, but they hate me. They hate me. They think, what a jerk. I mean, this guy, what a moron that of all, I thought we were friends. Of all the things Ginsu knives. And then 6 years later, they say, those are the best knives. Because I still have mine from 1975. And when I go into I have 200 knives, because I've moved a lot. When I go into my silverware drawer and I get to choose between a $75 or $150 or $300 knife or a $3 Ginsu knife, I choose the Ginsu knife because it's still sharp. And it really is true. You can cut through a car chassis and then a perfect tomato. You can cut linoleum and then make a cucumber sandwich. Don't tell me that Ginsu knives are not real. So I wanted to say that to her, because that's the truth. Or runner up the Ziploc bag, because that's the greatest invention of the 20th century. That's more important than the supersonic transport by far. So then, but I finally got a hold of myself and I said antibiotics, which of course is the right answer. But
sure.
But what a question. And then later that same day, this other person stumped me and said, because, these are kids that have been told, dream up a question. So said, who was your mentor or who handled your estate when your father died? Who was the executor of your father's estate? And I didn't know. And I had to say, I don't know. I'm sorry, so sorry, And I was so ashamed, Steve, that I went away and I said, I will never be stumped again. I will never be stumped again. And I'm just lucky because I could be stumped on, 40 times a day, but I never have been stumped again because I decided this was going to be the standard, that I was never going to be stumped. And man, is that a tough gig, because there's a lot that we could never know, of course.
Well, especially with your method of doing the performance, staying in character, and then coming out as to stay in character requires a depth of knowledge, and it's what's frightening. Most people won't be experts on Sandburg, but Lincoln, well, if there's 1,000 people that are experts on Lincoln, I'm 2,000th. I'm so far.
But you don't pretend to be an expert on Abraham Lincoln, but you can be one of the world's leading experts on Carl Sandburg.
Right, in Sandburg's Lincoln. And but you study the rest of Lincoln too, the other people who wrote about him, to help fill in and have a clearer picture of Lincoln and be able to see the difference between Sandburg and some of the other portraits of him. So but you're right. I think I sort of have that same feeling. I don't want to be stumped. So that's why I keep reading, why I keep taking notes, why I keep looking over the notes and say, oh my God, how many times have I forgotten that?
Samuel Johnson, the great British moralist, said, mankind requires more often to be reminded than informed. And boy, is that true. We need to take a short break. When we come back for the third segment of this program, I want to ask you about how you organize your notes and how you remember everything that you have to remember. And I hope that you will recite us a poem, either by Vachel Lindsay or by Carl Sandburg, or both for that matter. But we need to take a quick break. Thanks for listening, everyone. When we come back, more discussion of how to waste your life being a Chautauquan. We'll see you in a minute. Welcome back to this special edition of Listening to America. I'm Clay Jenkinson. Stephen Duchrow is across from me. We saw each other again the other night at the Row Center in Crystal Lake. I've been to the Row Center many times. I love it there. I said and I meant that my two favorite places to perform are Seattle Public Library at their town hall and at the Row Center. And then the next one would be the great TCC Roper Theater in Norfolk. And the only reason I don't put it higher on the list is it's undergoing extensive and difficult renovations. But there are a handful of places that I have a little sign on my handler's whiteboard that says, always say yes, always say yes. And one of them is the Row Center, because I love it there so much. Describe it in 30 seconds to those who've never been in it.
It was a theater built in 1929 by the architect Elmer Behrens, and it was a mission-style theater. They called it the El Tovar at the time. It's an atmospheric theater, as if you stand on the balcony and look out, you see the little Spanish villages, and then there's a twinkling night sky. So it's meant to put you in, not just seeing a movie, you're in an environment. So it's a beautiful theater, and that community really worked hard, and just to be credited for saving it and operating it. It's no small thing to run a theater and keep it going. It is hard work.
What was your role in this?
Well, I guess you would call me the founding executive director. There was a hardworking group of citizens that had tried to build a performing arts center. They tried to put one out at the Holiday Inn when that was being built. So there was 2 or 3 failed attempts. Finally, they bought this building for $600,000, and then I came in. They hired me at that point to sell the community on the idea, finish the fundraising, help oversee the renovation of it, hire the staff, open the building, start the programming. And we did all of that in 3 years. I got there in 98. We opened it in 2001. It was supposed to open on September 14th of 2001, but there was September 11th. So we had to postpone the start by a few weeks. But it's a lovely theater.
It's a lovely theater, and I love to perform in these historic theaters where so much has gone on, and very little of it, the kind of work that you and I do, it's truly magical to be there, and that's important to me. So let's go to memory. I was once young, and I could memorize more easily than I can now. You have to, if you're going to do Sandburg, you can't be up there saying, here's my Norton anthology of poetry. I thought I'd read you a few poems. You have to memorize, and memorization is really difficult. How do you do it?
Practice. I'll do a voice recorder of the piece. I'll have my handwritten notes. I'll walk around saying it out loud. I listen to it in the car. I practice. I try to learn a small section, break it down into small sections, and then continuing add and then review. You have to do all of those specific things. I use mnemonic tricks. I use anything I can to get those difficult passages, and you know the ones that you just can't seem to remember and get right, or get the word order right. And then at the end of the day, I just try to be the character and get on stage and do it, and try to lean into it and bring people into the experience and hope that I get it right.
My father-in-law, deceased, was a 33rd degree Mason, and he gave me a mnemonic plan, because they have to memorize scads of stuff, and it works. And that is to type out the first letter of each word in all caps. So we hold these truths to be self-evident. You type W, H, T, W, T, B, S dash E. We hold these truths to be self-evident. And for the whole passage, and then you also have the written passage typed out next to it, and so you go back and forth and back and forth. And it doesn't take long before that simple little jogging system helps you speed up the memorization.
One of the tricks I try to use that I was taught was to take key lines and create a little image. The bigger, the sillier the image, the car crashing into an elephant that explodes into a tie-dye shirt, and you just link those images together so that you now know those little key, because sometimes you just need the word to trigger you, and then that'll put a difficult passage together, so you've got it. So there's a number of things I try to lean into. And somebody said, right before you go to bed, go through the passage. Right when you wake up in the morning, pick it up and read it, because that's when the mind is fertile and ready. So yeah, anything you can use to memorize it, you use.
I'm going to give this talk. I think I might have told you about this once when we were together, that I love Charles Dickens. If I were on a desert island and I could only have one set of books, I would have the complete works of Charles Dickens. And I find his use of language just unbelievably masterful and fascinating and compelling. And I give these Dickens seminars, and people come and dutifully read them because I say so, and they're always like wanting to kill me because it's so hard and the plots never hold up, but I don't care. But so I have this friend in Thompson, North Dakota, who made me a ukulele. He's an instrument maker, and he made me a beautiful ukulele. And then I did something for him, and he said, I want to pay you. And I tore up the check and said, no, you made me a ukulele. And so he said, what can I do for you? And I said, Dickens gave these readings all over the country, U.S. and England and France, and he had a special desk made for himself, and there are images of it. We have actual photographs of it, and we have illustrations of it. And I said, make me that desk. So he did. So now I have this beautiful, beautiful Dickens desk that has a little slide out for your pitcher of water, and it's just exactly what he had. So I've got a Dickens costume I ordered. Because he made me that, I said, what can I do for you? He said, well, I want you to come on December 7th, 2024, and perform Dickens reading some of his work. So I stupidly said yes, of course. And so now, and I know a lot about this because we have books about how Dickens did it and so on. But I will read mostly because that's what he did. But I want to memorize some pieces of it too, because it just feels like that should be essential. So I'm memorizing the first page of Bleak House, which is one of the greatest things he ever wrote. And he talks about the mud and the fog and the drizzle and the bad tempers of everybody on this day in London in November, before this endless court trial takes place called Jarndyce versus Jarndyce. And so I've been memorizing it. And so like on airplanes and in the car and when I go to bed at night, I'm like, London, Michaelmas term lately over, and the Lord High Chancellor sitting in his chair in Lincoln's Inn Hall. And then I go like a sentence and a half and it breaks down. And so then I get up and turn the light on and look at it again. And so I'm stuck. I will get through it because there's nothing that concentrates the mind like a deadline. And so I will get that. I'll be able to do that. And I'll be able to do It Was the Best of Times and It Was the Worst of Times from A Tale of Two Cities. But every day now I think, December 7th, that's like tomorrow. And then I get into this panic, like, oh, And the worst thing that can happen to you is if you mostly have it, but your confidence level isn't high. So you get up there and you're sort of in the third sentence and it's sounding like a guy trying to remember what he remembers.
You're right. That is the worst feel. You'll be ready. There's that lovely story about the little girl who's read all of his works that approaches him on the train.
What happened?
Oh, he's, the way I remember it, he's on a train and, he's not that approachable. He's might be in a bit of a, sour mood. And there's this little girl who wanted to go see him. She's 11 or not, she's very young and she doesn't get an opportunity to go see him, but she's on the train and he's on the train and somebody's sitting next to him, this woman. And so finally the woman gets up and the little girl goes over and sits next to him and says, Mr. Dickens, I love your writing. You? And he begins to light up. It really humanizes him. He's like, hey, you? Yes. What is your favorite book? She said, I've read all of them. But this one. And so then he engages his conversation. He just fills with light. It's this really lovely, wonderful moment. And I've got that story somewhere, but I don't know how you would tell it in first person, but it's really charming. It really humanizes him. And I think it's really a touching thing to bring to an audience because they'll warm up to Dickens.
That's a lovely story. It really is.
But there's another story. I was in Boston and I can't remember which hotel it was at. And in it, there's this room in the mezzanine which has mirrors on three sides. It's like a big hallway and there are mirrors on three sides. And that's where Dickens rehearsed because he didn't just read. He grimaced and did gesticulations and frowned and moved his head and cringed and, his eyes got big. And so it was a theatrical, he was a born actor and it was a theatrical performance. And you can't just do that. You can't just imagine yourself doing it. You have to watch yourself doing it. And so he would then rehearse there with that very table that I'm talking about. And then people were able to buy tickets to sit around behind him and watch him rehearse into that three-sided mirror arrangement. And the mirrors are still there. And I was there, and this will never happen, but I would love to perform Dickens reading Dickens in that mezzanine in Boston. But imagine what it must have been like. I mean, it's hard to find an analog in our time, but I suppose let's just use Paul McCartney or Taylor Swift. If I had a chance to sit 15 feet from Paul McCartney with his back to me, looking in a mirror and rehearsing a new song, I'd spend $1,000 to do that. I wouldn't spend that for Taylor Swift, but my daughter would mortgage my house for that. So there you are. She went to see Taylor Swift, and I disinherited her. I said, you don't need any more of my money if you're going to pay to see Taylor Swift. But she disinherited me. She counter-disinherited me over this. So I'm not with the zeitgeist, and she is. But to see Dickens, to see one of the world's great creative artists creating. Did you see the Apple endless documentary on the Beatles?
Yes, 3 times.
All right, so
I'd watch it. I'd watch it again another 15 times.
It's amazing.
Extraordinary.
And, a couple of things. First of all, the first hour was so excruciatingly heartbreaking that I could barely watch it. To watch this extraordinary group of people breaking up in real time.
It's disintegrating.
Yeah,
disintegrating.
But then, Paul is playing every instrument and doing everything as usual, and George is sullen and John is agreeable, but, his fixation is on Yoko and Ringo is just zoned out as always. But at one point, Paul writes a song, is tinkling out a song on the piano that is not yet ready. He doesn't even know it. He's creating. We're watching the creation.
Yes.
I can't remember what song it is, but it's one of the great ones that he's playing right there, tinkling it out. And you think, I am watching the creative process by a genius happening right now.
When he does Get Back and they're like throwing lyrics in there. And then when Billy Preston shows up and the energy explodes. It's fabulous. My daughter and I went to see Paul McCartney in Fargo, North Dakota. And, she was spending the summer with me and he was performing. It's about 200 miles from where we live. And I said to her, we are doing this. If you get a chance, young lady, she's 22 or 3 years old, to see Paul McCartney, we are going. And so we went, and he's lost a step or two, as we all do. But when he got to Hey Jude, 20,000 people wept. Yes. I mean, you're a good father for giving that experience, because it is life changing to have all those people singing together. It's yeah. You should come to Beatles Fest in Chicago. That's a remarkable event if you're a Beatles fan.
Well, I am a Beatles fan, and I would love to do that. I'd love to do it with you. So I'm never going to portray Ringo or Paul McCartney or John Lennon or George Harrison, but I do portray historical characters, and you portray historical characters. We're lucky that our characters are no longer living. That can be a real problem. And yes. I'm lucky that my characters no longer have many descendants, although I've had to perform in front of a few Roosevelts. And that's always a little dicey because, of course, they own their historical figure and we only pretend. And so, I mean no disrespect by that, but people have a strong feeling about their own families. And so that makes me very nervous. And I think I told you the other day that I performed Oppenheimer near Las Vegas in front of a bunch of people from the atomic test site, and they were all physicists, and I was just terrified. I wanted to say, look, we built the bomb. Any questions? I'm out of here. Oh, thank you very much. That's it for today. Because I thought they're going to say, like, now when plutonium descends into its constituent elements and that proton is lost and it's reabsorbed by hydrogen, what's the throw weight of something like that under certain conditions? And I was just going to throw myself on a sword right in front of the audience. And luckily, they asked only polite questions.
And all this is wheeling through your head while you're working through the performance. You know that moment's coming, right? And you're hoping it doesn't happen.
One time, I will have to close after this, but one time I gave a Meriwether Lewis performance in Cripple Creek, Colorado, up in the mountains. And it was for the Colorado Endowment for the Humanities, and 100 people came, and most of them were senior citizens, and they were just the kind of people that come to programs like this. But just as I was about to be introduced, these 5 buckskinners came in, and they were wearing they were fur trade people. They had knives, and their hair was down to their ankles, and they had greasy buckskins, and they had pieces of beaver pelt, and the whole panoply of this stuff. And I thought, oh, geez, here we go. And so after I gave like a 4.5-hour monologue just to keep ahead of them. But finally, I had to ask for questions. And the minute I said, are there any questions, they all shot up both arms, like, oh, God, here we go. But then I'd say there was like an old blue-haired woman in the far back, and I'd say, that woman has a question. And she'd say, was it terribly hard, Mr. Lewis, being out there? And I'd answer that for 45 minutes. But finally, I had to answer a couple of their questions, and they were kind. But afterwards, they came to me, and they said, Professor, we love that. Can we take you to lunch? So I said, sure. So now you're in a Gary Larson cartoon. We go in character to a diner in Cripple Creek. And so there are 4 or 5 true mountain men with all of that, what all that means. And then there's me in kind of a designer suit of buckskins, And right. So we get in there and we order our tuna melts and so on. It just feels like we're lost in a Gary Larson cartoon here somehow. And so we're eating, and they're pumping me with questions and thoughts. And then one of them said to me, Professor, have you ever eaten dog? Because Lewis and Clark ate a fair amount of dog.
Yes, right.
Of that. And so it kind of took the edge off my appetite. But I said, no, I have to say, I've never eaten dog. And then one of them leaned across the table as if it were like a drug deal. And he said, we could make that happen. So that's what's happening in Springfield, Ohio. This has been such fun, my friend Stephen Duchrow. Thank you for taking the time. I know I'm asking a lot of you here. I want to come to Beatles Fest, so keep me posted on all of that. I need to see you perform. But before we go, give us one poem.
Sure. I will. Let's do Carl Sandburg's Grass,
which is one of my favorite poems. I read it in high school.
Which connects, I think, well to the Oppenheimer film and the performance. Grass by Carl Sandburg. Pile the bodies high at Austerlitz and Waterloo. Shovel them under and let me work. I am the grass. I cover all. And pile them high at Gettysburg and pile them high at Ypres and Verdun. Shovel them under and let me work. 2 years, 10 years. And passengers ask the conductor, what place is this? Where are we now? I am the grass. I cover all. Let me work.
You're visibly moved by that, and so am I. You know, it's a great poem. It's a World War I poem. He's part of a very distinguished World War I group of poets, but he's an American. And that is a world-class poem, and of course, it evokes Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and for that matter, the desert around Alamogordo. My friend Stephen Duchrow, thank you very much. I hope to see you soon. And when you're ready with Mark Twain, I'm ready to heckle. And to all of our listeners, we'll see you next week for another important edition of Listening to America.